Greetings! I hope everyone is having a great day. I know I'm certainly excited because by the time this video goes up, we'll have finished the first week of the 2023 college football season. And I love me some college football. Like, I enjoy professional football. I definitely have a few favorite teams in the NFL, but to me, college football and the NBA are where it's at when it comes to sports. However, in today's video, we're going to be talking about that other kind of football, the one with a round ball. Even though for some reason this was a European release, and yet they still used the word soccer in the title. Anyway, if you're not familiar with Zilog and Moto, you might be wondering what just said video is going to be about. I mean, I'm sure you know it's going to be about European club soccer, seeing as how that's the name listed in the title, and I'm going to assume that you can read, unless you're a fan of insert team from Twitter. Oh yeah, I guess I should have finished that joke. Anyway, well, here on Zilog and Moto, I've got a goal of collecting every English language release from the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD, as the case may be, and the 32X. And English language in that last line is key because no matter if it was released in Europe or the US, or even Brazil in some cases, as long as I can read what's on the screen, it's on my list. Which of course is especially important with this week's release, as it's a game that specifically came out in Europe. But I don't want to just collect these games. No, what I want to do is create a centralized archive of reviews for each of these games that everyone can see and reference, and maybe find a new game to play that they've never heard of, or possibly know when to avoid something like the plague. Now, normally when I do these reviews, if I'm looking at a game that was released in multiple regions, I'll mention that, and when it comes time to look at the package, I might throw up a picture of screen of what the cover looked like in the other regions, just as a comparison. But that's it, as normally, other than possibly some differences between NTSC or PAL timings, or possibly name changes like John Madden Football versus John Madden American Football, or Reggie Jackson Baseball versus American Baseball, there's usually not that much different between the releases in other regions. However, sometimes games are changed significantly, and in a situation like that, it can be worth it to give them another look. For instance, old school Zilog and Motoers might remember that I looked at the original NHL hockey way back in episode 17, and then followed that up with a look at its European brother, EA Hockey, in episode 20. Looking back on that, I probably shouldn't have reviewed those so close together, and I'm not sure that EA Hockey really needed a separate review, as really EA Hockey is just a palette swap version of NHL Hockey, replacing the NHL teams with generic country-based teams and creating a nasty tournament bug in the process, but I'm still glad I did it as I learned something and collected copies of both games. This week the situation is a little bit different. Back in episode 82, I reviewed World Trophy Soccer for the Genesis, which was, I don't know, an okay soccer title, I suppose, and I gave it 2 stars. However, the European version of that same game, European Club Soccer, appears to be a bit different, as it was how the game was originally intended to be before being modified to be better sold to American, or Japanese for that matter, audiences. Does playing the game in its original incarnation make it a better experience? Or is this just the same mediocre soccer game with a different coat of paint that got by previously because it was simply the best soccer game available on the console at the time? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of European Club Soccer. I can't remember when I picked this one up, but I think it was in the last 2 years or so. It's another eBay special, as is the norm for almost all of the European releases that I have in my collection. If you're not aware, for whatever reason, it's just super rare to find PAL games in the States, with even Japanese games being more common. Case in point, I was just at a local flea market that runs every few months, and as I was browsing around, I ran into a Japanese copy of Castle of Illusion randomly amongst some other more common games, and that's just kind of how it goes around here, with PAL titles even being rarities at conventions. Anyway, being a sports title, and honestly not a very good one, I'm sure I probably paid more in shipping than the game actually costs, with even complete copies like this routinely going for well under $10 on price charting. Being that it's a relatively common title, I was able to pick one up that was in good condition without much trouble. The outer portion of the case looks fantastic, with the hang tab intact at the top, and the inner cover looks great as well, with no odd wear issues, water, or sun damage, that I can tell anyway. And as we'll get to in a moment, the manual and cartridge have held up well, with neither appearing to have seen a ton of use. As far as the front cover goes, I actually like this cover a lot. I think the art is framed well below the logos for the game and the Mega Drive, and it's a nice action shot of a player bicycling a shot past a helpless goalie, all in front of a raucous European crowd. I really like the nice touch of the flag of Europe being tucked into the European Club Soccer logo at the top. And this is something that I learned this week, that the flag of Europe actually dates back to 1955. I had always thought it was a newer creation that was related more to the more modern implementations of the European Union. Good old American school system, yeah. Anyway, in all seriousness though, when comparing the cover art for European Club Soccer to its brothers World Trophy Soccer and J-League Champion Soccer, European Club Soccer is easily the best looking of the bunch. I don't hate World Trophy Soccer, as it does have a unique look, but it's simply not in the same class. And don't get me started on J-League, which has possibly the worst looking Japanese cover that I've ever seen. No idea what they were thinking there. Flipping over the back, and we've got 4 slightly fuzzy screenshots over to the left, and some of that lovely microscopic flavor text on the right, due to Virgin trying to support 8 different languages. And I'm sorry, but that flavor text is pretty lame. I get that they didn't have much room, but compete for the Super Cup, soccer's highest accolade and exclusive to European Club Soccer? I mean, I guess it's cool to create some sort of mythical championship between the champion of the European Cup and South America, but it's kind of hard to get excited about a highest accolade that doesn't actually exist, unless you are referring to the European Super Cup, which is a totally different thing that is apparently some sort of competition between the winner of the Champions League and the Europa League, which is all the teams that weren't good enough to make the Champions League. Sorry, I'm getting off track here and learning far too much about European soccer leagues in the process. Opening up the package, and as mentioned, the cartridge and manual are in great shape, with someone relocating the blue Sega Steel sticker to the inside of the case, which I definitely don't mind. As far as the manual goes, it's pretty beefy due to having to support those same 8 languages from the back, but don't expect anything too expansive, as each language only gets about 9 pages. And honestly, I would be okay with that, as it's not a terribly complicated game, but there's definitely some missing information here, and it's not covered in-game either, but I'll go on to that in a minute. Okay, that's the package. Let's revisit World Trophy Soccer in its original incarnation, and see if having that original vision helps at all, or if it's still the same mediocre game. When I review games for the channel, I tend to do a lot of research. For instance, in that previous section, I knew to call the soccer championship that the game is based on the European Cup, because that's what it was called at the time, and it wouldn't change to being what is now known as the UEFA Champions League until the season that took place directly after this game was released. But I'll be honest, I know very little about club soccer. Sure, I know some of the larger Premier League teams, or some of the more well-known club teams from other places around Europe, like Bayern Munich, AC Milan, Real Madrid, Paris Saint-Germain, or the recently famous Wrexham. But as far as what happened when, or even something as simple as who the current cup holder is, not a clue. And I'm sure someone will yell at me in the comments about that. But look, there are only so many hours in a day, and I've got a legitimate need to spend all day on Sunday playing Wirehead and not watching some random fixture. Where was I again? Oh yeah, anyway, when I'm doing a review, I tend to do a lot of research about the game in question. But what I usually try to avoid like the plague is other people's reviews of the game, as I want my opinion to be exclusively mine based on my feelings when I played it, and not be influenced by what other people thought. Sometimes I'll briefly look at how games did in the press after I've written most of the review, but for the most part I try to be a blank slate to that aspect of things. However, with me already having reviewed World Trophy Soccer, it was somewhat unavoidable to see some of the other reviews and scores that people had of both that game and European Club Soccer. as they're so linked that when you look up European Club Soccer on GameFAQs, it specifically takes you to the page for World Trophy Soccer. I didn't go back and specifically reread what I wrote about World Trophy Soccer, but I remember personally not liking it and thinking, well, perhaps we were giving it some credit that it didn't really deserve due to it coming out before FIFA and Sensible Soccer on the Mega Drive, so it really was the best soccer game available at the time. Also, I was trying to keep in mind that what I was playing was at best a cut-down, edited version of the game that had national teams shoehorned into a game with a tournament system that didn't reflect the World Cup system, which was just odd, to say the least. It wasn't like soccer games that had World Cup-like tournaments included were uncommon at that point. Hell, I remember playing Jellicoe's Goal on the NES, and that game dates back to 1989 in the United States. This line of thinking was part of the impetus for me wanting to give European Club Soccer its own turn on the channel, as I wanted to play the game in its original unedited form to try to see if perhaps it really was a better version of the game, and that might be part of what I was missing with other people giving the game relatively high review scores. Thankfully for me, the hardest part of that was simply just importing the game from the UK, as even European Club Soccer was originally designed for NTSC timings and not PAL, and there's no region protection to the game, so even if I didn't have a region modded Genesis, I'd be fine. And actually, the best way to play the game is in NTSC mode, as PAL mode is only partially optimized. So I booted up the game, curious to see how things would work with the reported 170 club teams being available to choose from. And just to pause for a second, I want to give credit where credit is due, because including 170 soccer teams in a single game on a console in the early 90s is simply ridiculous. Sure, later on Sensible Soccer would feature just over 100 teams, and Madden 94 had 80 American football teams, but I can't think of any other sports game in mid-1992 on a console that was anywhere even close to this ambitious. As impressive as this is, though, there are a few caveats to deal with. First, this is not a licensed game, which is super confusing to me. In the United States, if you released a sports game without licensing for a professional sports league, you could get away with calling a team, say, Chicago National instead of the Chicago Cubs, and maybe even giving the team red, white, and blue coloring, but that's about as far as you can go. However, in European Club Soccer, the teams have their actual names. For the teams where their name is the city that they're from, okay, that makes sense, you should be able to get away with that. But what about teams like Real Madrid, PAOK, Chelsea, or the various dynamos of the former Soviet republics, just to name a few? How the hell does that work? Now, granted, the actual team logos in-game are slightly edited from their real-life counterparts, and the kits might not be quite perfect as well, hence the addition of the kit editor to the game, which didn't really make much sense in the World Trophy Soccer version, by the way. So, I guess their argument is that they're just teams with similar names? I don't know, I'm sure that there's different laws for this sort of thing in Europe, and I'm certainly not complaining, but it just seems weird. Names or no names, one thing is for sure, and that is that not all of these teams are created equal. Which is a problem because of how the game is presented, or not presented in this case. The team selection process is fine, I suppose, in that you pick a country, and then pick from the teams in that country, that's logical. But what if you wanted to know the characteristics for the players on the teams? Or even just a general ranking of the teams in categories like speed, passing ability, things like that. Yeah, none of that is present in the game, which would have been okay if it was listed in the manual or some sort of addendum like the team cards that came with the early EA Sports games, but as I mentioned earlier, you're only getting the bare minimum with the manual, and that definitely does not include team statistics. This relative lack of identity of the players also renders one of the game's supposed selling points completely useless, and that's the ability to have substitutions, with 2 substitutions allowed per game. Each team is made up of 15 players, your standard starting 11, and then 4 subs. But with no statistics regarding players, how would you know which of the 4 players you should put in? Not to mention that all you do is select the subs, you don't even get to choose who they go in for. So what are you left to do?
Well, I suppose you could just pick your favorite team and hope their virtual representation doesn't suck too horribly, but what I ended up doing was picking a team that was definitely good at the time in AC Milan. They didn't win the European Cup in 1992, but they would go on to being the runner-up in the inaugural UEFA Champions League the next year, so I figured they would be a good choice to attempt a playthrough of the game with, and after some previous experimentation with some of the other teams in the game, they definitely appeared to be one of the better squads. And I suppose trial and error when choosing a team isn't the worst thing in the world, as it will force you to experiment a bit, but with 170 teams? Yeah, it's a problem. Another place where the game is a bit disappointing is the complete lack of any kind of statistics. Even if you've never watched soccer, you may have seen stat lines from the games go across the bottom of the screen while you're watching something else. And in those stat lines, not only do they show the score of the game, but they also show who scored for which team and when they scored during the match. So having said that, I would expect at a bare minimum for there to be a screen at the end of the game that has that same information, even if it was in abbreviated form like in World Championship Soccer, where if there's too many goals, it will only show the first few. Nope. At the end of the game, you get a score with pictures depending on whether you won or lost, and then it's on to the next thing. Now, keep in mind, and I feel like I'm being reasonable here, I'm not asking for stats to be kept from game to game, and I'm not asking for anything besides goals, so no assists, yellow/red cards, saves, none of that stuff. Literally just a record of who scored when during that specific game, but that was apparently a bridge too far for the developers. Now, I could see not having any sort of general team statistics. I have access to the internet, and I can go see what teams were worth choosing in 1992. And I can deal with not having specific goal records, or any kind of stat keeping for that matter, because clearly the game is supposed to have more of an arcade feel, even though its main game mode is a large tournament. And I can deal with a sloppy implemented team formation configuration where you can only choose your team's formation before a game starts. So Lord help you if you get behind and want to switch to a more offensive positioning to possibly climb back in contention. And I can even deal with not having battery backup included in the game, so that to save your spot in the tournament, you have to rely on passwords. The game did come out in mid-1992 after all. But what I can't deal with is abysmal gameplay. I had vaguely remembered this being a problem when I played World Trophy Soccer, but playing European Club Soccer this week was like ripping open an old scar. For the most part, European Club Soccer is a soccer game that is simple to pick up and play, with automatic play for the goalies, and the option to have the computer automatically pick which player you're controlling depending on where the ball is, or to leave that as a manual choice on your part. However, there's two problems. The first problem goes back to that automatic goalie play. I'm all for having the computer control your goalie to make saves. I'm sure I wouldn't stand a chance if I had to try to make all those stops myself. But once the goalie makes that stop and you get possession of the ball, you should be in control at that point and be able to direct the offense up the field. This is not the case, and instead you're at the whim of responding to whatever the computer decides to do with the ball. It's inefficient at best. But that's a minor problem compared to the other glaring issue of the game. And that is that players will frequently be passed the ball and then just run away from it, leaving the ball wide open to be taken over by the other team. It's something that I've never seen at any level of soccer, either in the real world or in video games. And while sure, there are times when players get past the ball and they make a misstep or just have a poor dribble and the ball gets tackled from them. That's totally normal. But what we're expected to believe here is either teams that are made up of literally the best players in the world can't handle passes to them at least half the time, or that the players are so stupid that it's totally normal for them to get the ball and then run away from it, even when no defenders are nearby. It's insane, and I don't know how any soccer fan, especially when playing it against another person, wouldn't just constantly be destroying their controllers. I thought I was going crazy or perhaps doing something wrong, so I broke my rule about reading other people's reviews, and sure enough, in the first review I read, which is from the June 1992 edition of Megatech, reviewer Mark says, "There are loads of niggly little faults, such as if a player turns too fast the ball shoots away from them." So clearly I wasn't the only person to see this, and I just can't understand how the game was shipped in this condition, as all you can do to combat this is to play the game in easy, which then turns the computer's AI into that of a potato. While the game leaves a lot to be desired in many areas, the graphics and sound are at least well represented. The pitch is represented horizontally, and the field scrolls smoothly, no matter how many players are on the screen at the time. The action moves relatively quickly, and it's easy to overrun balls, but that's certainly far better than things potentially moving too slow. I would have liked to have seen some differences in the pitch, with at least a few different looks to the fields for some variety, but overall I can't complain too much, and I do like how the numbers on the players' jerseys are totally legible and not just some random pixels. The music from an, at the time, 19-year-old Matt Furness is a nice bright spot and serves the game well, since it's distinctly lacking in crowd noise for anything besides goals. Having said that, the sound effects aren't nearly as impressive as the music, but they're not bad, just kind of run-of-the-mill for a soccer title. Am I glad that I decided to give World Trophy Soccer, European Club Soccer another chance? Yeah, I think I am, especially for the fact that I confirmed what I thought about the game previously, so I'm no longer worried about what other reviewers may have thought. I didn't miss anything, the game is what it is, but playing the game in its original configuration does make it make more sense, even though they were lazy about replicating the European Club Tournament and having it be just a ladder rather than breaking into group stages at the quarterfinal level. But honestly, considering all of the other places the game came up short, that might be my most minor complaint about the game. And I suppose they should be given credit for the massive amount of teams included, and the fact that it supports 8 players to be entered into the tournament, but at the end of the day, it's a soccer game that is fundamentally broken, and no matter how many teams or players are included, or when it was released, it's not getting higher than 2 stars from me. And honestly, I'm not even sure it should get that. If you really love the European club system, or this particular era of soccer, I could see maybe giving it a look, but in 2023, it's easy to say that there are far better 16-bit soccer titles that you should probably spend your time with instead.
Okay, and that was European Club Soccer. This is a great example of a game that, had it just been tweaked a bit in development, it could have been a legendary title on a console, but as it stands, it's pretty deserving of its place in the bargain bin with lots of other sports titles that no one cares about anymore. And it's too bad, because I think this is a fantastic concept for a soccer title, as there's clearly more to the sport than the World Cup. Hopefully, when I get around to a certain sensibly designed soccer title, I'll get to experience the European club scene as it should be. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, surprise, surprise, I've messed up the schedule again, in that I was supposed to be reviewing a certain European exclusive Master System title, but when I went to purchase it a few months ago, so that I actually had it on hand to do the review, I put it off because it was pretty expensive at the time, and I never went back to look for it again. Oops. Well, instead, I'm going to review another Master System game that wasn't released in the United States, but it wasn't released in Europe either. Yeah, I'm finally getting around to one of those games. Should be interesting. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 210. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.